based on your work, where do you see the beginning and development of Papamiento? For example, the various influences of other languages and how they combine to create Papamiento.
Okay. Well, that's why I sent you the article by Jacobs. He gives a very well-based result of research, and I'm printing it for your question. That the origin is virtually certain in the Cape Verdean Creole, so at the African coast.
Oh, okay.
So, and he's probably right. I think yes. So this is not my field of research. I follow or read about it. There has been quite a few theories about the origin, but this seems to be very tangible, right? Very realistic as well.
Yeah.
And of course, there's been a lot of influence from Portugal, or from Portuguese and Spanish, and also Dutch. But that is the vocabulary, and there are also Indian words and words that derive from the Jewish community,
Of course.
which spoke Spanish or Portuguese. It depends where the Sephardim, right?
Yes.
But the structure is probably to be found in Cape Verdean Creole. The influence of Portuguese is not because of the proximity of Brazil,
Yes, of course.
but because of the slaves coming from Africa, where Portuguese formed the basis of a Creole language.
Okay.
So and later on, Indian words by Indian tribes, right? There's quite a few Indian words for many things on the island, especially animals and vegetation. And where does Dutch come in? Dutch is the language of the government, the governance. Let's put it that way.
Yes.
It was a Dutch colony, so. But even then, the local elite spoke Papiamento, the Papiamento language, already in the 18th century. Everybody who lived there, really stayed there, spoke Papiamento. All classes. And of course, there was a Dutch governor, and there were civil servants, some from Holland, and they would speak Dutch. And the local elite knew Dutch, and most of the people with some education knew Dutch, but they wouldn't speak it.
Very interesting.
They'd speak the Creole language. As far as the elite was local elite.
Yeah, of course.
I mean, they had been there for a generation or 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. As soon as they settled, and they could be from anywhere, from any Dutch or Western European country, Norway, Finland, Sweden, Denmark, Germany, Portugal, Spain. When they came and they settled, then they would start to speak Papiamento. And the Jews, of course, who fled Portugal and Spain because of the Inquisition.
By class, but were there any times in the history that they tried to maybe
suppress it? Or suppress it?
Yeah, suppress it.
Well, as long as it isn't part and parcel of education, and then the colonial powers don't do very much to promote the local language, right? But even that doesn't mean that it was forbidden to speak. It was never forbidden to speak it, and if you wanted to write it to whoever you wanted to write, the family or friends or what have you, that was fine. I don't think any Dutchman would ever bother about that. But then everything that was official, legal, or government related, that would be in Dutch. In the 30s, industrialization came to Aruba and Curacao with a refinery, huge refineries. Dutch in Curacao, because of the Shell company. Shell was the Dutch British company. The Shell refinery, it was called with a different name. It had a different name in those days. But and in Aruba, it was Exxon. And Exxon was an American company. And so they promoted English. Well, you had to. I mean, if you wanted a job and everyone wanted a job, you needed to know Dutch on the refinery, or English, and in Aruba especially English. And so in that way, Dutch was promoted as well. But then in the 80s, so it's not so long ago, when we lived on the island, I lived on the island quite a few years, the Shell company retreated. The refinery is still there. It is the refinery hired by the PDVSA. PDVSA is a Venezuelan oil refinery company. Yeah. So then they come along with Spanish. Only in the past 10 to 20 years, Papiamento, because my kids had to learn Papiamento too. I'm not a native speaker of Papiamento, and our kids grew up there. Then at a particular moment in the 90s, so that's only 25 years ago, Papiamento began to play a role in education, basic education. And now it is part and parcel of even secondary education. So it takes up a lot of time, of course. I mean, if you're a native speaker of Papiamento, it's easier than for non-native speakers. But whatever way you look at it, it takes up hours in the curriculum, besides Dutch, English, Spanish.
Okay.
You need to. These are the 4 languages you are taught. You start with, nowadays, with Papiamento, but there's a lot of discussions about it because you need to learn other languages as well. You can't do without it. I mean, it's not like you or me, you with your Spanish.
Yeah.
You survive with Spanish. And I survive with Dutch. There are a lot of Dutch people who don't know any word in English or in Spanish or in French or whatever language. But even, I give that as an example, even if you are helping people with the gas for your car, right? You need to know a little more than just Papiamento, because the people that stop there on the island may be tourists. They will be tourists too, and they will speak Spanish or Dutch or English. So Papiamento is hardly ever sufficient to really get any kind of job, except a job where you don't need to say very much. But in schools, they start with Papiamento for the native speakers of Papiamento. There are some schools that have Dutch and will immerse you in Dutch, which is, of course, related to ideas about how do you learn a second language, and when do you learn a second language best about it. And bilingual education is being promoted, but that is difficult on the islands, because would that be bilingual, Papiamento English, Papiamento Spanish, Papiamento Dutch? It's also related to, do you have curricula, do you have books, do you have it all needs to be developed. It's a difficult question, yes, but it has everybody's attention. It is people understand, anyone also here in Holland, that on the islands, Aruba, Bonaire, and Curacao, people speak Papiamento. It's generally accepted as a given fact. It is not just shoved aside or something. This Creole. No, never. There are quite some differences, but then I'm not an expert in that. If you would really want to know that and hear the differences, then I could give you the name and the email address and Skype of a lady in Curacao.
Okay.
And she's just become 80, but she's still working together with a few other people on a dictionary in Papiamento. Okay. There are dictionaries, but they are Papiamento Dutch or Dutch Papiamento. Okay. And they are now working in a team with people from Aruba, Bonaire, and Curacao on a dictionary Papiamento, like you have in Spanish explanation and most of the languages. And they realize very much that you have many words that have just a slightly different. I'll give you an example in a minute, which I experienced myself. Between many words that have a slightly different meaning, or they're slightly differently pronounced. There's syntax differences. There are some differences, inevitable. You have that in Spanish too, even between districts, right? All over the world you have that. And they have that too. Examples. I give you one example which I experienced myself, because the kind of Papiamento I've learned is, of course, the Papiamento of Curacao, which where I lived for 20 years. And there's a word, an old word, I think it is related to the Spanish señor, and it's called shon. And it was used, the word shon was used for slaveholder and white master. Okay. But in Curacao, it gradually changed its meaning. It became, of course, it meant already that shon, the señor, was somebody with status. But then it lost its associations with slavery and being a plantation owner. It began to mean, in about 100 years ago, it is well documented, just you use the word for someone you appreciate, of which you have a high esteem. So you would just use, well, you wouldn't do that. I mean, women don't do that. It's more, one man might do it, say that to another person, his age or older. You would do it, you might use it, but then for someone who's older than you are. Okay. So it's like a reverend friend, or I admire you. That's when you use the word shon. If you were the age of 60 and I was younger, I could use Edith. It was right?
Yes.
I'm sorry, I forgot. Yeah, I could use that word, shon Edith. So I wouldn't just name you, but I would use that word. Okay. But that is only, so if you greet somebody you don't know, you might say, bon dia, Shon. And you would say, buenos dias, good friend. But you do that only in Curacao. I was in Aruba, and I entered an office, and there were a few people. And Curacao, I could say, a good day, Shon, Shonan, in plural. And then I said that in Aruba too, when I entered the room with a number of people I didn't know. So I was saying, buenos dias, good friends.
Yes.
And they looked at me. You come from Curacao, don't you?
Okay.
Because here, the word Sean means but one thing, and that is the slave master.
Okay, so it retained its meaning.
Its meaning. So that's a fine example of the meaning has changed. Everyone used the word Sean in Papiamento, in Curacao, but from that moment on, I knew I couldn't use it in Aruba.
Yeah.
There is, of course, some Hispanization, but it depends on the economic sector.
Of course.
I mean, tourism is influenced by English.
Okay.
But then in Aruba, Spanish is also a great influence because a substantial number of people come or have come to Aruba to work there. Mm-hmm. And they all come from Latin American countries where they speak Spanish. Okay. I think about a fourth of the people have Spanish as their native language. So that has an influence. And Dutch, of course, has an influence because it is the government's language. Although nowadays in Parliament they speak Papiamento. In Aruba, Bonaire, Curacao, all that has changed too. Okay. But all documents, legal and government documents, will also appear in Dutch and in Papiamento. So there is a moment, I don't know whether I wrote about that in that article, but that article is based on a book. I don't know, you probably haven't seen it. I'll show you. This is the Dutch version, so it's slightly thicker than an article. But this is about the history of Papiamento writing. And at a particular moment, that was in the 20s and 30s, when it was evident that most of the people would find work in the region or in Latin American countries, writers and they wrote especially in newspapers, would Hispanize Papiamento just to help the people. I remember one example. In Spanish, the word for mirror is espejo, right?
Yeah.
And in Dutch, it is like, do you know any German?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. In German, it is Spiegel. In Dutch, it's the same word, Spiegel. We have this sound. In Papiamento, they have the Dutch-related word for that, spiel and spiel.
Okay.
Now, they would start to change words that had a Dutch-based influence, like spiel, and they would start to use like Spanish words. In Papiamento, he was looking in the spiel, in the mirror, and that he would say he was looking in the espejo. And they knew that the Papiamento people would understand it, and they hoped that they would start to use it instead of the Dutch-based word, which is strange, but they did that. They did that quite consciously in the 20s and 30s. They wouldn't change the syntax. You can't do that.
Of course.
But they would, in Papiamento, the plural is with the suffix nang, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So you take flor, which is flower, and then nang, flor nang. But they wouldn't really change that into the plural in Spanish, with an S. You have. But they would also change the o and a which is the gender, well, it's not really gender aspect, but the gender aspect in language you have in Spanish. El espejo, la situación, right?
Yeah.
Then el and la, and they would that also influences the plural at times in os and us in Spanish, right?
Yeah.
Now they would apply that sometimes also in the Papiamento text.
Okay.
But that was rare because it didn't really felt really comfortable. Then you were almost touching on the syntax, and that wouldn't really work.
Yes.
But very little is being produced now.
Okay. I see.
People have started to write in Dutch again. I don't know exactly why, but the reason is partly because so very few people read literature in Papiamento. It may be promoted and everybody speaks Papiamento on the island, but then again the status is limited. Especially for a younger generation, you find them that singing rap music, for instance, okay, that's fine. They do that in Papiamento too, change it with some Dutch and English or Spanish or whatever. But then, and they don't bother it being literature or not. No, since the 1860s, around the time of the abolition, there's been quite some literature with changes in topics and have you. And so I've tried to discuss that in the article. But it is limited. But compared to other Creole languages, it's substantial. Because in most of the times, people don't write in any Creole language, and they do in Papiamento. There was some poetry related to the occasion of emancipation, it is called.
Yeah.
And then in the 20s and 30s of the last century, it changed. It was very much based on Roman Catholic ideology or religion, and it was concerned with the changes in society. There were a substantial number of threats in the eyes of the Roman Catholic authors. Secularization, whatever came from the West, was considered to be a danger because people would stop being Roman Catholic. And then the secularization grew, especially during the war, the Second World War, and then people started to write about just anything that belonged to the island, especially black culture as well. No longer just poetry about the king and queen in Holland, but write about the people on the island. And they did. But they were, like I said somewhere, they have virtually described every cactus on the island by now. There are numerous performances, festivities, and then any author will recite well-known poems, and people love it. And they're very rhythmic often, and people know them by heart. But if you'd ask, do you know when it was written, where it was, well, it's not that important. It's no. In a Papiamento-speaking community or environment, a whole sense of belonging on the island is in Papiamento.
Of course.
But I know quite a few here that here in the Netherlands, quite a few people from the island that may speak Papiamento, but they are also well versed in Dutch. And especially if they are married to a Dutch person, a woman or a man, they will certainly speak Dutch and not Papiamento. I have a friend and he's married to his native language is Papiamento. His wife's native language is Dutch, and they will not educate their kids bilingually. They will just teach them Dutch.
I see.
But on the island, you grow up with Papiamento. It's part and parcel of your life, of everything. Everyone realizes that you need to know other languages. You won't survive, not on a social level that you would feel comfortable. Yeah. You can't. Yeah, well, it's it. You survive nicely if you know Spanish only, but you won't survive nicely if you know Papiamento only.
Oh, true.
You can't. It's virtually impossible.
Yeah.
So, yeah, and the younger generation, they know that, but they grow up with Papiamento. Many are bilingual in that sense, either Spanish, English, Dutch. Not everyone has the potential to learn just 2, 3, 4 languages. It's hard. Yeah. It's very hard. And it is difficult for a great number of youth. It's inevitable. I know dozens of Dutch people who don't know any English or leave alone German or French. And it's the same on the island too. You may know a few words and may how to order a cerveza, a beer, but that's about it. Yeah. But really to have a command of a language like English, or well, you know it yourself. I mean, you're fluent in Spanish. Yeah. It takes quite some time. It may be your native language, but then to learn and really be able to write in Spanish, that requires a school education. Yeah. But then if there's another language to be learned, like you know English, and to really learn and study in English and have a conversation in English, that requires years. Yeah. So that's the same on the island. In that respect, it is, of course, a very harsh, stark reality for many people. Language, of course, is part of your identity. Yeah. It's no different there than it is for you. One of you came from Nicaragua, I think, or the other from, what was the other language?
United States. Yeah, I'm from the U.S., yeah.
Okay. Well, then, of course, the language reflects, it's part and parcel of you. And with that, it is never isolated from people. The people are from Nicaragua or wherever you come from. And so of course it reflects a Caribbean identity. It's spoken there. It's part of your life. And it became part of my life when I lived there. So does language reflect the Caribbean? Of course it does. It always does. You are Curaçaoan, you're Aruban, you're Bonaeran.
I see.
You are in Papiamento, Judy Curaçao, Judy Aruba, Judy Bonaire. Yeah. It's obvious.
Yeah.
Of course, there's such a thing as an identity related to any of the islands. And if you grow up in Holland, and your parents are, or one of your parents is from Curaçao, that's part of your identity too. Like now you are acquiring some German identity too. It's identity is anything with which you identify, which becomes part and parcel of you. I've been doing practice in Aikido. Aikido is a Japanese martial art. You heard about that? Aikido is like a fighting thing.
Yes.
But that becomes part of you when you practice it. And you don't lose it. You can't just put it aside. It becomes part of you. And so languages. Well, yeah, I hardly understand the discussions about this is my identity. It's like essentialist. It's fluid. It changes all the time. It stops when you're in your coffin. That's it. Dutch, the Dutch government and Dutch companies have quite an influence on the island. It's inevitable. Yeah. They're part of the kingdom. That's what I wanted to say with Germany is part of Europe. And you may not feel it every day, but let me say the Dutch hardly ever think of Aruba, Curacao, and Bonaire. It's just far away. The other way around, yes, they very often think of Holland, because what they might want, whatever it is always related to what here in The Hague is decided.
Of course.
So, yeah, it's inevitable. It has an... For instance, now with the Irma storm, which was more than a storm.
A hurricane.
The hurricane.
Yes.
It's the same word in Dutch. But, it's devastating, right? And there's hardly anything left of St. Martin. So the first thing they think of is Holland. Is Holland going to help? And Holland says, yes, we help, but there are some conditions under which we help. So it's inevitable. The Dutch and Holland, and it remains an important influence, and such it's part of their identity. More than the other way around. I mean, for most of the Dutchmen, the islands aren't part of their identity. Besides education, education is a very important means to... well, it won't get lost, let's put it that way. Because of education, people speak it everywhere, really everywhere. There's not a sector where it is not spoken. If you're native speaker Papiamento, you speak Papiamento. And there are funds to do some research. At the university, they do some research in Papiamento. Like I said, there is a group of people working with funds. I don't know where the funds come from. Who's working on a dictionary. Internationally, there are scholars that do research on Papiamento. You are such students, researchers. There's music and songs. There are, well, the research I could do with funds, European fund, also has a kind of effect of giving more status to the language, because you do research. It's being republished. And it's the international. I think UNESCO may do its best. Really, now it won't just disappear. There was a lot of in secondary schools. I can't remember. They talk about, of course, the colonial status or semi-colonial status we now have. It's not really a colonial situation, but the dependencies, how it began with the Indians who were killed, slavery. It's part and parcel of education. When it's useful to start talking about it, not when they're very small, but when they get older. And certainly in secondary schools, every year, again and again. But whether it is the kind of education I think is very... let's put it that way. It seems as if slavery starts at the African coast, and it doesn't. It began in Africa, and there's very little talk about being sold. primarily they talk about the beastly way the Portuguese or the Spanish or the Dutch treated the slaves. They talk about it. I've been teaching for a few years on the island. Later on, I started doing other things. I wrote a course on literature in English from the Caribbean. And it's also about Rastafarianism, about slavery, about Indians, East Indians, right? But I remember very well one of the students, the secondary school that was, said, "Oh my God, could you please stop talking about the Caribbean? I want to know what life is like in America." I know what the carrot yards are. I live in one. I don't tell me what it is like living in Europe. It's just like, I never forgotten that because it's because I've been doing with a few other teachers, hard working on a curriculum on Caribbean literature and English, and but it's being discussed. It's not an issue. I lived there in the 80s and the 90s, and ever since, it could be discussed. It was discussed. You talk about it. You write about it. About anything related to slavery, oppression, Indians being killed or devastated by illnesses, diseases, what have you. People do research in it, and when I still hear, "Oh, we know so very little about it," then I say, start reading. Do something. Don't give me that anymore after 30 or 40 years. There's so much. But the issue is more that the context is forget. It was a disaster to live in the 18th century, in the 17th century, in the 19th century, and be happy with the developments that make it possible for. I give generally an example of that we are speaking.
Yeah.
100 years ago, I would never think of speaking with a woman about something like that. You wouldn't even be a scholar 100 years ago. So, isn't that great? There are many things that are wrong, and we need to improve on that. But let's also focus on the fine developments that come out of disaster.
Of course.